is a great honor to have His Highness Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum, Vice President and Prime Minister of the UAE and ruler of Dubai, here with us today as we interrogate the notion of Africa rising, leading the continent towards change. The aim of this session is to focus on the hopes and fears of the continent, the opportunities our esteemed guests see for investment in Africa and perhaps more specifically in their own countries, and the challenges they face in generating that investment. We've created for you, the audience, a polling question today for the session, and I will ask you to vote on that in about a half hour's time, and we'll use the results to continue our discussion. Just in case you don't know, I am Becky Anderson from CNN. I have a show called Connect the World, which I'm very proud to say these days is broadcast from our programming hub in the UAE. I moved here in March and I'm absolutely delighted to be here. Let me introduce my esteemed panel. His Excellency John Dramani Mahama, President of the Republic of Ghana. His Excellency Paul Kagame, President of Rwanda. And His Excellency Mr. Mulatu Tesomi Virtu, President of the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia. Right, chaps, let's do it. The Economist newspaper's latest white paper, Risk and Reward, the Gulf's push into Africa, which, let me tell you, audience, is available to you through your iPads, points out that over the last decade, the majority of African economies have achieved very robust growth, yet the continent now finds itself at a crossroads. This paper points out last year, Standard & Poor's rating agency warned that Africa's boom years might be over. They say, owing to the shifting dynamics of commodities markets, the return of the developed markets to stability and civil conflict affecting a number of countries, not least Nigeria, Kenya, Mali, South Sudan, and North Africa. Growth, though, is not over. So let's discuss the opportunities on a continent with an infrastructure financing gap, I am told, a loan of nearly 100 billion annually. President of Ghana, with growth of $48 billion in 2013 and a percentage growth of near 7% year on year, that's pretty robust. Certainly much better than most of the countries I've been banging around in Europe of late. How do you assess the current state of growth, and where do you see the current opportunities?
Thank you, Becky, and let me thank the organizers for having us. Thank Sheikh Maktoum for this conference. I think that Africa stands on the cusp of, exciting new opportunities. Decent infrastructure is being put in. Telecoms has exploded around the continent, and it's being utilized optimally, to continue to sustain growth. We suffer a shortfall in terms of investments in infrastructure. In my country, it's estimated at a deficit of about $1.5 billion every year we must be putting in to bring the infrastructure up to scratch. But certainly infrastructure is much more decent than it used to be a decade or two ago. And we have sustained positive growth over the last 2 decades. In recent times, growth of an average of about 7%. And so I do think that going into the future, there are a few things that we must do to continue to maintain prosperity in Africa. One is to ensure that we have enough energy. And so indeed in Ghana, what we're doing is prioritizing energy. We want to be the hub of power production in West Africa, be the most efficient producer of power, both to meet our own rising demand. We're seeing year on year, between last year and this year, an increase of 12% in the demand for power in Ghana alone. And so we believe that more investments in power will meet not only our own demand, but then because we belong to what we call the West African Power Pool, we have an interconnection of our transmission grids. And so any excess power that is produced can be evacuated and exported to Nigeria, to Cote d'Ivoire, Sierra Leone, Liberia, Burkina Faso, and other countries that have a power deficit. But going forward, I think Africa, like any other continent, is a continent that has opportunities, and different business people from different parts of the world are taking advantage of those opportunities. We've seen what happened in telecoms. The same thing is happening in power, and it's going to happen in other places like transport. We have need for port expansion because there are bigger ships coming into our ports. And so those opportunities are exciting, and we're happy to attract investments from all over the world.
Thank you. We'll talk about those opportunities going forward. President of Rwanda, growth of some 9%, still slowing from the sort of dizzy highs of some 12% over the past years. What gives you hope, and what are your greatest fears at present?
Thank you. Happy to be here on the panel at the same time joining the forum, and thank Sheikh Mohammed for inviting us to be here. First of all, I want to say there are similar opportunities and similar challenges across the continent of Africa. You find in Rwanda, it's similar to neighboring countries and beyond. But we have seen growth in Rwanda, as you rightly said, on average between 7 and 8% every year for the last 10 years. Now, it's important to say that what constitutes challenges for us also constitutes opportunities. We have found challenges in the area of energy, for example, so that we have electricity to power our homes and industries and different activities that drive the economy. But these are also areas that need the kinds of investments we are talking about. So on one hand, they are a challenge because we don't have enough in terms of energy, but at the same time, this is an opportunity for investment. We have natural resources across the region, the East African community, and beyond on the continent. These are resources that can, continue to grow the economies of our country. But the opportunities are about investing in these areas, especially in making sure that they benefit the majority of the Africans. And that is mainly in the area of adding value to what we have as resources or what we produce. So these are things that constitute both sides,
Sure.
Challenges, opportunities.
Thank you. President of the Republic of Ethiopia, Gulf entities have provided some $30 billion of infrastructure funding at current prices over the past decade. That amounts to between 7 and 10% of inflows. Yours is one of the countries that has seen less Gulf investment than others. How would you, very briefly, assess the opportunities and threats to Ethiopia and to the wider continent?
Thank you very much. For Africa in general and for Ethiopia as well, what really we need for the continent is to develop peace and stability. That's the foundation of the economic and social development. So we need peace and stability on the continent in each African country. We need democracy and good governance. And then the sustainable economic development follows these pillars. In the absence of the democratization of the society, we cannot anticipate any economic development, especially sustainable economic development. And the three pillars, we say, democracy and good governance, peace and stability, and sustainable economic development. Once we have this in place, then we can have the vision of integrating into the world economy. the structural transformation of African economy. That is the agenda on NEPAD, the New Economic Partnership for Africa, which is owned by we Africans. It is not imposed from external, it is our own program, our own development program, and it calls for the global value chain and global supply chain participation of African countries. Once we have these three pillars in place, then the structural transformation of Africa will be a reality.
How long does that take, sir?
Well, it needs a good policy in place. It needs a good policy and realistic policy. It cannot be the same formula for all African countries. It has to be based on the objective realities of each individual African country. For Ethiopia, in the last 10 consecutive years, we have registered a double-digit economic growth. To be precise, it is 11.2% GDP growth we have registered. This because we have had peace and stability in Ethiopia, which was not there before. We tried to democratize our society by backing it up with good governance, rule of law, and sustainable economic development just follow. This is a reality. This is a taste by our own self. And
one of the conclusions that investment strategists have made in assessing trade flows, for example, between this region and Africa, and President of Ghana, perhaps you can address this first, and sub-Saharan Africa, is that investors oftentimes lack information. That there's a sense that Africa can be sort of lumped in together, and that people don't understand it. Perhaps less so from the BRIC countries who've made significant investments over the years in and across the African continent. But what is your message to potential investors here who with respect, may see less of the individual countries and more of sort of continent-wide issues? And let's face it, many of those issues are the same. But how do you differentiate, make sure that people understand?
And I think that it's important for us to let investors in the world focus on continent-wide issues, because it's in Africa's interest to grow our businesses across our natural our political borders. One of the major hindrances to Africa's growth is a low level of trade amongst ourselves. Our trade patterns are still connected with the colonial traditions that we inherited. And so in Ghana, we're exporting more into Europe than we export to other parts of the world. And I believe that at 11% trade amongst ourselves, I mean, that's shamefully low. And so it's good to have a bigger picture of the continent. But I do believe also that increasingly there's more information on the continent. Before, I mean, with the perceptions of the dark continent, nothing positive came out of there. The only news that came out of Africa was conflict, famine, and so on and so forth. I mean, that has changed dramatically. I mean, people see the new opportunities that exist, and all the major networks carry major programs about Africa and what's going on there. CNN, your station, carries phenomenal, airtime in respect of the success stories in Africa, African voices, and all that. And I think that increasingly more information on Africa is going out and what the opportunities there are. But I just wanted to add quickly, the potential for Africa continuing to sustain investments is that investments look for low-cost areas to do business. And with China becoming, what it's becoming, wages and compensations in China are going up. And so for some industries like light industry, and Ethiopia is doing that very well, attracting textiles, garments, and light industry into Ethiopia. And I think that a lot of African countries should be doing the same, attracting higher value, manufacturing, light industry and other manufacturing in order to be able to create jobs for what is the fastest growing population in the world.
There's no doubt that the spend on infrastructure has been absolutely transformative over the past couple of decades. President of Rwanda, what have you learned from the foreign direct investment, specifically, for example, from the BRIC countries, that has benefited your country and has perhaps not helped your country? And what might you take out of the investment over the past 2 decades, for example, as an opportunity going forward?
I think building on what President Mahama of Ghana has just said, let's face it, African economies are small if you look at each country on its own. It doesn't matter even for some of those which are known to be large enough, they are not big enough when it comes to a point where they stand alone rather than being together with others. So that's the first point. Integration, therefore, is very key. And even in terms of realizing some of the objectives, for example, in terms of infrastructure generally to connect Africa, which should be the case, because we realize that each country standing on its own, you don't go far. But together, we would just make the kind of movement forward that we all want. And that's why, even in terms of investments, the investors from outside are looking at scale. Where they're going to make investments, they are looking at the size of the market. There's no doubt about it. So integration, like we have had in the East African region, where you have Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Burundi, Rwanda, bringing together 135 million people, you stand a chance, a better chance, looking at it this way than if you disaggregated and looked at each country standing on its own. And some of the investments also that are to be made, say, in terms of infrastructure, whether it is railways or pipelines or energy and so on, the amount of investments to be made are huge, to the point that it is easier when countries pool their resources and also attract investments, in a sense that the investors will be looking at this large population rather than one single individual country. And that's how we have seen that these are lessons that have been learned over the years.
You're certainly nodding your head, President of Ghana. And sir, does that resonate with you?
Well, again, the important thing is that in order to attract foreign direct investment, we have to ask what comparative advantages the country possesses and the competitiveness in which industry we might be better off. In Ethiopia, if you take the Ethiopian example, we have assessed areas where Ethiopia has a comparative advantage to develop its economy. Of course, when we talk about the structural transformation of the economy, it is to say that we have to transform from low productivity, that's agriculture, to higher productivity economies. So we are trying to transform from agriculture to industry. And we are focusing on light industry because we possess a very good advantage in jumping into the light manufacturing industry. Ethiopia is known for as an agricultural country. Our backbone of the economy is agriculture, and it is very easy to transform the agricultural commodities into first to agro-processing. We have maybe the largest livestock population in Africa. So we take this as an example. We take the food processing in the meat sector, as well as the leather and leather products industry development. And I think that is an area where we have to identify which areas, like textile, is easy to develop in Ethiopia because we have plenty of land which is suitable for cotton cultivation. And it is easy also to vertically integrate the development of the textile industry and garment.
Go on.
I just wanted to say something about the question you asked about financing in infrastructure from BRIC countries. It's been critical and very useful. When traditional sources of investment dried up in infrastructure, the rise of China, India, and the Middle East, UAE, and others became an alternative source for attracting investment in infrastructure in Africa. And so some of the key infrastructure, highways, power plants, just name it, so many of them have been secured from BRIC countries. Of course, they have an interest in doing it because we use Exim financing, so it's like export credit. And so it helps the business of the country. But at the same time, it puts in the infrastructure and creates the environment that is conducive for us to attract additional investment. So in my country, the third hydropower dam that we built, 400 megawatts, was built with financing from China. We are just opening a new gas processing plant, which was built with financing from China Development Bank. We have a thermal plant, which was built by financing from Abu Dhabi. And so there are many of these infrastructure developments that are being financed by, the BRIC countries and other sources of financing than we traditionally would have got from Europe and America and the developed countries.
Can I be very frank? One of these stories that you hear time and time again, and something that is a challenge to every African country, it seems to me, is at times a lack of transparency. At times, issues of good governance. I'm not for a moment suggesting that these three countries are victims of those, but you will be well aware that that is a story which sort of is overarching across the continent, and I think is detrimental to any potential investor who can't get the clarity that they need. Is that still an issue? Is enough being done to tackle good governance, lack of transparency, that kind of the risks that come with that for investors, be those large, small, or medium?
That's a very key point you have made. Everything else said, there is a need for a predictable environment in which investors have to put their money. And therefore, rule of law, transparency, a clear fight against corruption so that it doesn't add the cost of doing business. These are very key. There's no doubt about it. In fact, part of our progress has been made on that basis in Rwanda, I mean, because if you look at the surveys made and indicators by the World Bank, for example, in doing business, where you have countries being ranked on the basis of how investors find it easy to do business, to open businesses, to close businesses, or to actually engage in certain transactions. These are very important, and we have found that in our case in Rwanda, because of the time and investments we have put in that, it has largely brought us dividends, whether it is about that transparency, it's a fight against corruption, it's the ease by which people do business. In our country, this has certainly had very huge benefits.
So what are you doing to actively fight corruption, to create a better governance environment, to create better transparency?
Yeah, we have a government institution which is called the Anti-Corruption Commission. And that is a government arm which really is fighting and making the society more transparent, especially the bureaucracy, which is basically being suspected as a cause for corruption. So we have this government institution in place. we also have inculcated the whole population to be not silent in the fight against corruption. So we have got rules and regulations in place against corruption. Maybe Ethiopia is, I could say, if not the only country, but one of the countries who put its prime ministers in jail for corruption. That means we already have created a system which is not sympathetic with corruption. When it comes to transparency, the Ethiopian investment law, the investment regulations, it is open to the foreign investor, to the local investor as well, to the whole business community. Everybody, the government knows its obligation, and the investor knows its rights and obligations also. So whoever is corrupting the system, be it from the private sector or the government side, we are intolerant.
Enough being done?
Yeah, Becky, without being country specific, I want to say that issues of accountability and transparency are much, much better in Africa today than they were in the past. The fact that more African countries are going for elections, more African countries have freedom of expression, more African countries have strong civil society organizations that are willing to speak up when they see, impropriety. It's creating a situation where, you find more transparency and accountability than we had in the past when we had more dictatorships. And so that in itself is creating a much better picture in Africa than existed in the past. But specific to each country, you must have the mechanisms to fight corruption. And I believe that in doing that, you need to put in place the mechanisms that create for more transparency, especially in procurement, for instance. You should put in place measures that make sure that if people are tendering or bidding for a project, they know that they're going to be treated fairly. Otherwise, then it drives away investors. I mean, if I want to bid for a project and I think that it was awarded in a shady manner to some other company, it's going to discourage me. And so I do think that in all our different countries, we're pursuing the fight against corruption in different ways. We all have institutions that are mandated to investigate corruption.
Do they work? Do they work? That's my point.
They work to varying extents. One of the major issues would be resourcing them adequately to be able to do that. And often when you have a budget that has so many competing interests, you have to build clinics to provide healthcare and prevent mothers from dying. You have to provide classrooms for children to go. Then you spread the budget across a wide spectrum of things. But certainly the fight against corruption is important because then it frees up more resources for you to be able to invest in those other things.
Paul, you were President of Rwanda. You were nodding.
These efforts do work. There's no doubt about it. But and you see it across the continent in many countries. Some doing better than others, but across, I think there is decent progress. But let me clarify one thing here. It's also important. It's one thing to have institutions that are aimed at delivering this. It's another to allow them to work in order for the good results to happen. So the two have to be there. You have to have the institutions and the mechanisms that are supposed to deliver this, but you also have to have governance structures in place, to allow them to work, and therefore you get results. There's no doubt about it.
Let's pause for just one moment because I'm going to ask the audience to vote on the poll that we have. I do, though, know that we thank you very much indeed, Your Highness, for being with us. I know that you will leave the room fairly shortly, and we will carry on as a debate and get a sense from the audience of their answer to the poll, which will be on your iPad. So if you'd like to do that now, and you can see that there is a question there for you. Which of the following obstacles to doing business in Africa should governments prioritize? A is a lack of infrastructure. B, legal and regulatory obstacles. C, small market size, fragmented consumer demand. D, high barriers to market entry. And E, poor education and skills. Some of those we have addressed already. I'm fascinated to see what the audience suggests. So if you'd like to now vote on that, and gentlemen, we will discuss the answer to that question as it comes in. You may or may not be able to see the results as they come up here. I'm hoping there'll be some results, and almost instantaneous, as you can see there. And just out front there, the lack of infrastructure, which is something that we have discussed. The idea that growth is such a weight on the current stock of infrastructure, I think perhaps won't surprise you, but let's discuss that. B, secondly, we're looking at legal and regulatory obstacles, which I think we've already discussed. Poor education and skills, not something we've addressed, and perhaps we'll address that now. And D, high barriers to market entry and a little small fragmented consumer demand there. I think everybody clearly realizes that consumer demand is huge and will continue to be so. Can we, if it's possible, just address this concern of a lack of infrastructure? That is what our audience believes is the biggest obstacle to business going forward, sir.
Yeah, Becky, and I think that the audience is quite savvy about the situation in Africa, because certainly the way, they voted, reflects a reality. And so as leaders, one of our major preoccupations is attracting investment into infrastructure. Because if you must create an enabling environment for people to come and invest, they must have power, they must have water, they must have roads, they must have good health care. I mean, if people will come and, invest and work in your country, they want to be sure that if something happened to them, there's a good hospital they can go to. And so the issue of infrastructure is critical. But let me say, I was also quite intrigued that they flagged legal and regulatory as another major area. Most of our countries are transiting, from state-dominated economies. When we gained independence, most African countries started with very strong state-dominated economies. And it is from the 1980s and 1990s that shift to allow the private sector more space to operate has begun to take place. And so we need to change the legal and regulatory environment in order to create an enabling environment for the private sector to be the dominant force in driving the economy forward. And so I find I'm not surprised that they flagged that too. That's important. But certainly just a very short comment on education and skills. What we're trying to do in Ghana is to see how we can align our educational curriculum with what the job market wants. We inherited a colonial education from our colonial dominion, Great Britain, which was mostly to go for a grammar school education, speak very good English, be very theoretical, but not practical and skills oriented in terms of what you do. And so we have a lot of people doing the humanities and other courses like that. But you find that increasingly in Ghana, what business is looking for middle-level technicians, engineers, and other such courses. So you have thousands of graduates coming out of university with MBAs, with marketing degrees, and so on and so forth. But industry is looking for more technical skills. And so how do you match the skills that industry wants with what you're producing from the universities? That, for us, is what we're dealing with now.
Gentlemen, do you see the same problems?
Yes. Yeah, problems are across the continent once again. And I speak from the standpoint of coming from a landlocked country, for example. Rwanda is. So the issue of infrastructure is key and is always heavy on our mind. I'm sure in the same way the investors who want to invest in Rwanda are thinking about this. How do they overcome this barrier as well as Rwanda thinking about it? And that's why investments in infrastructure, whether it is roads, it is energy, it's telecommunication infrastructure, and so on. And in fact, this also helps to integrate countries. It also boosts intra-African trade that has been on a very low scale, when it would actually have more benefits if this was to be improved than even the other trade we already have going in place. So that is very key. And then, of course, regulatory environment is about predictability, as we said again, and it's about skills. If you look at and across the continent, the young population that we have, 50% under 20, is incredible. So we have to invest in skills for them to get jobs and so on and so forth.
Before I come to you, sir, with respect, I want to thank His Highness for being with us today. I know that you will be now leaving the room. We will carry on for another 10 minutes or so as we discuss. Right. You'd like to stay? We would be delighted to have you, sir. Thank you very much indeed. Fascinating discussion. Sir, let me give you an opportunity to react to what you saw from the audience so far as where it sees the greatest problems that need to be accounted for.
Well, I think the infrastructure, that's the most important, because when we talk about infrastructure, we're talking about maximizing profit of what the investor needs. In order to maximize the investors or the economic profitability, we have to facilitate the investment environment, and infrastructure comes really at the forefront. Then, next to infrastructure, I think investing in education, skill development, especially in investing in technical and vocational higher learning institutions is very important. Again, this will add to the Africa's quest for global value chain and global supply chain participation. Unless we have good infrastructure in place, unless we have a capable, trained personnel in place, I don't think that will be competitive enough for investors to come from abroad and invest in Africa. The rest, I think, it really all goes with the level of the development of the economy. When you take especially the legal systems, it always is a reflection of where the country stands. Country with no industry cannot have industrial policy and industrial rules and regulations. I'm not saying that it is not necessary, but it is a reflection of what the level of the country is standing at. And coming to the fragmentation of the market also, it is true. Basically what we Africans produce is primary commodities. And we want to sell that primary commodities. And now we are saying to get transformed. When we start regional integration, which we already have in the 5 different regional economic entities, that is a road ahead. But industrialization really has to come, and we have to be able to be in a position that we can trade with each other.
Let me give you all, with just about 5 or so minutes to go, an opportunity to give some sort of concluding comments on, and I'll use this white paper that The Economist has just produced, which I thought was absolutely fascinating. And I do encourage you all to get access to that through your iPads. Risk and Reward, the Gulf's Push into Africa. as I said, pointing out over the last decade, the majority of African economies have achieved robust growth, yet the continent, this paper certainly pointing out, finds itself at a crossroads. I know that you've made some very substantive points about where the continent and your own countries go next. As you, sir, give us sort of a minute's worth of concluding comments, if you will. If one of the organisers, I know that we've got questions coming from the audience. My iPad isn't working here, or I'm not doing it properly. So somebody just wants to bring me another iPad. I'll certainly take some of those questions right at the end. But sir, a minute, 60 seconds. Do your best.
Yeah, Becky. I just want to conclude by adding to what President Kagame said right at the beginning. He said that where Africa faces some of its biggest challenges are where there are opportunities. And of course, infrastructure is one of Africa's biggest challenges. And so that's where there's opportunity for investment. The current system we are all looking to is public-private partnerships. In the past, as president and as government, would have had to raise all the investment to build the ports, to do the electricity, to do the telecommunication system, to do the roads and all that. Today, increasingly, if you create the right environment, the private sector will come in and will take responsibility for that. And so public-private partnerships are the way to go. We've done it in telecommunications. Just by deregulating telecoms, we've had the private sector invest massive amounts of money in telecommunications. We can do that for energy. We can do that for transport. We can do that even in education. You can have the private sector setting up schools and providing a quality education. And so creating an enabling environment and giving space to the private sector to participate in infrastructure development is the way forward.
Question for you, President Kagame. With East Africa now seen as the new frontier for oil and gas, what's the collective view of East African governments in efficiently exploiting the resource and using the proceeds for the benefit of East African people? And apologies for not giving you your concluding comments, because I think now it's important that we address some of these questions.
Yes, in the conclusion, very briefly, one, I have to state that Africa's transformation is possible. And we've got to fix a number of things. One, good governance, we've got to fix infrastructure, we've got to fix skills and knowledge-based investments, and we have to make sure that the connections between African countries and therefore increased intra-trade and investments can happen. I think with this, there is no doubt. But that particular question you've raised falls in the first category, where we have to fix governance. When you are governing for people and for people's transformation, then you make sure that the resources of the country are managed to the extent that they benefit the very people you have in mind. So, and I think this is happening. We don't take anything for granted. We have to continue working together and making sure that everything falls in place.
Very good. Okay. I'm just going to give you an opportunity, sir, to make a very brief sort of concluding comment. But if you could also include the issue that many people will see, which is that of civil strife, for example, across the continent, something that will be worrying investors and those who are looking for an opportunity to see a risk rather than reward will look to civil strife in various countries and say, this is a concern.
Absolutely. The civil strife is not what we need in Africa. And when I said something about peace and stability, I think the need for any country in Africa, any country in the world for that matter, to have a stable and peaceful society is to avoid civil strife. And in order to avoid that civil strife, you need to have a democracy and transparent society in place. So the civil strifes we have here and there in Africa, it is arresting the development of these countries. The situation we have, especially in the young country in South Sudan, which was really endowed with very rich natural resources, oil and gas, but this aspired development could not take place because of the absence of peace and stability, because of the civil strikes. So it is very important. All the continental organizations, the African Union is working to have a strife-free continent. The regional organizations, ECOWAS or IGAD from West, also SADC, these regional organizations and also the continental organization, African Union, including the United Nations, international community, is working hard, hand in hand, in order to make Africa stable, peaceful, and strife-free.
And with that, because you kept yourselves to time, I thank you very much indeed. I will thank you all for joining us today. It's been absolutely fascinating. His Excellency John Dramani Mahama, the President of the Republic of Ghana, His Excellency Paul Kagame, the President of Rwanda, His Excellency Dr. Mulatu Tesomi Vertu, the President of the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia, and to His Highness for joining us. We thank you very much indeed.